Dusty's lonely ranch. Dust swirled around Dusty River's worn boots as he surveyed his herd. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dry, cracked earth, painting the cattle in hues of orange and brown. They were good stock, healthy, strong. Sarah would have been proud. The thought, unbidden as always, twisted in his gut. He pushed it down, the way he'd been doing for the past 3 years, focusing on the task at hand. He nudged his horse, a sturdy quarter horse named Blue, forward, separating a calf that had wandered too far from its mother. The calf bawled, a plaintive sound that echoed across the vast emptiness. Dusty gently guided it back to the herd, his movements practiced and efficient. He was good at this at the work. It was the only thing that kept him from completely unraveling. He spent the rest of the afternoon mending fences, the rhythmic clang of the hammer against the metal posts a monotonous counterpoint to the silence that usually enveloped the ranch. Each swing was a physical outlet, a way to exhaust the restless energy that gnawed at him. He knew he was avoiding it. The reason he preferred the company of cattle to people. The reason he hadn't been to town in months. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of purple and rose, Dusty rode to the small family plot nestled beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees. Sarah's grave was marked by a simple stone, etched with her name and the dates of her short life. He dismounted, tying Blue to a low-hanging branch. He knelt, running a calloused hand over the cool stone. "Evening, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Cattle are looking good. Had a little trouble with that Johnson bull again, but I think I got him sorted." He paused, the silence broken only by the rustling leaves. "The wildflowers you planted are coming up real nice this year. Remember how you used to get so excited about the first blooms?" He swallowed hard, the familiar ache rising in his chest. "It's lonely here, Sarah. You know that. Real lonely." He looked out at the sprawling ranch, the land stretching to the horizon, a testament to his hard work and his enduring grief. "Sometimes I think I can hear you, Logan, in the wind, seeing you in the sunset. But then I open my eyes, and you're gone." He stayed there until the stars began to appear, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky, sharing his thoughts, his fears, his unending love. He knew she couldn't hear him, not really, but it helped, somehow, to speak her name, to keep her memory alive in the silence of his life. Back at the ranch house, the silence was even more profound. The house, once filled with Sarah's laughter and warmth, now echoed with his solitude. He lit a single lamp, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He ate a meager supper of beans and bread, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. He tried to read, a worn copy of Lonesome Dove, but the words blurred before his eyes. He couldn't concentrate, his mind drifting back to Sarah, to their life together, to the day she was taken from him. He stood and walked to the fireplace, where a pile of unburnt wood sat. He picked up a piece, turning it over in his hands. The wood was dry and smooth, worn from years of sitting there, and used. He hadn't lit a fire in months. There was no one to share its warmth with. He tossed the wood back onto the pile and went to the window. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The ranch stretched out before him, silent and vast, a lonely kingdom ruled by a broken king. He stared out into the darkness, his heart heavy with grief. He thought of going to town, of seeking out some company, some distraction from the pain. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He didn't want their pity, their well-meaning platitudes. He just wanted Sarah. He turned away from the window and went to his bedroom. He undressed and lay down on the bed, the empty space beside him a constant reminder of his loss. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, to escape, even for a few hours, the crushing weight of his loneliness. But sleep was elusive. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with memories, with regrets, with the gnawing fear that he would never be whole again. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, the mournful howl of a coyote in the distance. The sounds were a symphony of solitude, a constant reminder of Dusty's lonely ranch, his lonely life. And as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, he knew that another day of silence and solitude awaited him. He was trapped, bound to this land, to this grief, with no escape in sight. Martha's silent suffering. The sharp click of Mrs. Bellwether's teacup against its saucer shattered the stillness of the kitchen, making Martha flinch. Sunlight, a single golden blade, cut through the room, highlighting the dusting of flour on her apron as she worked the dough. Though her joints protested, she couldn't rest. Only a flawless loaf could deflect their ever-present disapproval. "Hurry it up, girl," Mr. Bellwether rasped from his perch by the window, his voice like brittle twigs snapping underfoot. "We haven't got all day to wait for our sustenance." Martha's reply was a mere croak, her throat tight. "Yes, sir." 3 years she'd toiled within these walls, a relentless cycle of thankless tasks and bitter rebukes. Only 6 months since Thomas, bless his memory, had perished in the mill accident, leaving her stranded with his parents, caught in the web of their judgment. The scent of baking bread usually offered a small measure of solace, a flicker of happiness amidst the monotony. Today, it merely sharpened the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, a reminder of the scant portions allotted to her. With the bread in the oven, Martha was banished to the garden. Once her haven, a vibrant tapestry of colors and scents, it was now a wilderness of neglect. Weeds strangled the life from the few surviving blooms. Her small act of defiance withered. Mrs. Bellwether, perched on the porch swing, watched with eyes like polished stones. "Keep your hands off the roses. They're too fragile for your clumsy touch." Martha ignored the jab, wrestling with the parched earth. It clung stubbornly to the invader's roots. Pulling and straining, her fingers grew tender and began to bleed. But then, among the tangle, a solitary poppy blazed, its scarlet petals unfurling towards the light. A fragile ember of hope ignited within her. Dinner passed in strained silence, punctuated only by the genteel chime of silverware and the measured rhythm of the grandfather clock. Martha served the Bellwethers generous helpings of roast chicken and potatoes, while her own plate bore only a meager fragment of fowl and a single, undersized potato. "This chicken is desiccated," Mrs. Bellwether announced, pushing her plate away in disgust. "You can't even manage the simplest meal." A flush crept up Martha's neck. She had poured hours into preparing this supper. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she mumbled, her gaze glued to her plate. "Sorry won't fill our bellies, girl," Mr. Bellwether retorted sharply. Thomas would be ashamed. The words struck like a physical blow. Though moisture stung her eyelids, she refused to yield. She wouldn't grant them that victory. The heavy silence returned, broken only when Mrs. Bellwether's voice, thick with scorn, dripped into the quiet. "You should be grateful we allow you to remain here. You would be nothing without us. A destitute widow begging for scraps." Martha's hands shook as she cleared the table, the weight of their contempt pressing down on her like a shroud. She was insignificant. She was useless. She was a prisoner. Later, confined to the small, stifling room that had once been Thomas's sanctuary, Martha finally surrendered to tears. They flowed freely down her face, unchecked and silent. The single window offered a glimpse of a star-dusted sky, a boundless freedom that seemed eternally out of reach. She curled up on the narrow cot, the worn mattress offering little comfort. The oppressive quiet of the house amplified her isolation. Her fingers traced the familiar pattern of the quilt, lovingly pieced together by her mother for her wedding day. A wedding that felt like a distant echo. Exhaustion eventually claimed her, but her slumber was fitful, haunted by visions of Thomas's tragedy and the Bellwethers' cruel visages. Just before dawn, she dreamt of a field overflowing with poppies, a vibrant ocean of red stretching to the horizon, a place where she could finally be unchained. She awoke with a gasp, the image of the poppies clinging to her consciousness like a whispered promise. A town encounter. Harmony Creek always felt like a transgression to Dusty Rivers. The hamlet, a cluster of sun-bleached buildings clotting around a parched plaza, chafed against the grain of his solitary life on the ranch, where only the wind and the cattle's mournful bellows disturbed the quiet. He secured Buck to the hitching post outside the mercantile, the saddle leather squeak and the rowel's chime jarring in the midday hush. Shading his eyes beneath the brim of his hat, he observed the townsfolk, a mixture of ranchers, merchants, and dawdlers, their gazes a blend of curiosity and appraisal. Recognizing several faces, he offered terse nods before retreating into the store's cool shadows, the mingled aromas of dried provisions and treated hides of balm after the dust and sage. He collected his staples: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, the bedrock of his existence. Mr. Abernathy, a sinewy man with eyes like agates, tallied his purchases, his scrutiny lingering too long. Dusty paid, the coins ringing on the worn countertop. Clutching the supplies, he yearned to escape the confining space and the judging stares. As he returned to the boardwalk, a voice, laced with acid, sliced through the air. "Honestly, Martha, you're an abomination. Can't you manage even the simplest errand without humiliating us all?" Dusty halted. The voice, sharp and pitiless, belonged to a woman, her intonation steeped in disdain. He turned toward the sound, pulled by an unseen thread of apprehension. Across the way, before the milliners, stood Martha Bellwether. Her posture was defeated, her spirit visibly diminished. Flanking her, two formidable figures, a thick-set woman, face ruddy with indignation, and a lanky man with a stern countenance, were unleashing a torrent of criticism. Her in-laws, without a doubt. "Look at you, fumbling with the eggs like a simpleton." The woman's voice rose, shrill with condemnation. "Do you have any idea how much those cost? You squander our hard-earned money, you thankless creature." Martha, ashen-faced, clutched a broken basket. A yoke trickled down her hand, a sorry testament to her misfortune. The man, her father-in-law, added his barbs, his voice a frigid blade. "Your incompetence is truly staggering. Thomas will be mortified." The words hung, leaden with accusation. A wave of fury washed over Dusty, a visceral impulse to intervene. His fists clenched, knuckles bone-white. The injustice of it chafed, the public chastisement a scar upon Martha's dignity. He noticed the almost imperceptible flinch, the quiver in her fingers. Her downcast eyes reflected the harsh sunlight like dull pewter. He recalled the single poppy valiantly blooming in the Bellwether's neglected plot, a vibrant defiance against the drabness. He recalled the dream, the effervescent field, the promise of a life unlived. A small crowd had coalesced, drawn by the spectacle. They observed with morbid fascination, their expressions a tableau of pity and amusement. Nobody spoke, nobody challenged the Bellwether's assault. The silence was an endorsement, a quiet approval of their cruelty. Dusty felt a vice grip his insides. He knew the Bellwether's reputation, parsimonious, implacable, and fiercely guarding their assets. He knew the town's whispers about Martha, the insinuations of her unsuitability. He knew he should turn away, hold his tongue, and avoid entanglement. Yet, he found himself incapable. He watched as the woman wrenched the basket from Martha's grip, flinging the remaining eggs into the dirt. "Go home," she spat, "and don't expect any supper tonight." Martha offered no resistance. She simply turned and shuffled away, her shoulders slumped lower than before, her head bowed in utter defeat. She passed mere feet from Dusty, her gaze fixed on the ground. He saw a solitary tear carve a path down her cheek, a silent scream of anguish. He longed to speak, to offer some solace, some acknowledgement, but the words remained lodged in his throat. He was an outsider here, a bereaved man wrestling with his own ghosts. What claim did he have to interfere? He watched her recede, her small frame swallowed by the throng, vanishing around the corner of the boulangerie. The Bellwethers lingered a moment, surveying their handiwork with self-satisfied expressions before turning and marching off in the opposite direction. Dusty remained rooted to the spot, the sacks weighing heavy in his arms. The square, once animated, now felt stark and barren. The sun blazed down, yet he felt a chill seep into his bones. He should leave. He should climb onto Buck and ride toward his ranch, back to the familiar isolation, back to the quiet that, if nothing else, was reliable. But he couldn't cast aside the image of Martha's ravaged face, the echo of her in-laws' venomous words. He couldn't dismiss the injustice he had witnessed. With mounting resolve, he knew that he couldn't simply walk away. The anonymous gifts. Sleep proved a fickle sanctuary for Dusty. Martha Bellwether's grief-stricken visage lingered behind his eyelids, her defeated posture a mute, persistent accusation. Dawn brought no solace, only amplified the conviction ignited the previous afternoon. Inaction was no longer an option. He devoted the day to observation, a phantom presence skirting Harmony Creek. The Bellwethers, their faces masks of smug malevolence, churned his gut. He watched Martha's weary dance through her chores, her spirit seemingly bludgeoned by their scorn. The neglected yard, the peeling paint clinging to her cottage, all spoke of a life stripped bare, reduced to mere survival. As twilight stained the sky with shades of plum and fading rose, Dusty finalized his plans. A direct confrontation with the Bellwethers was premature. His immediate goal was to buoy Martha, to offer quiet succor without exposing her to further humiliation. He assembled what he could from his sparse provisions: a jar of his mother's sun-soaked peaches, a loaf of bread purchased in the neighboring town, and a modest cache of potatoes. He included a packet of coffee, recalling the tremor in Martha's hand as she offered him a cup at the mercantile, a silent act of hospitality in a world determined to deny her simple pleasures. These he nestled within a sturdy woven basket unearthed from his saddlebags, a forgotten echo of a simpler, gentler past. Patience was key. He waited until the moon cast spindly shadows across the hamlet before venturing out. The air, crisp and redolent of wood smoke and damp soil, cloaked his passage. He avoided the main thoroughfares, hugging the alleyways and forgotten paths, his footfalls muffled by yielding earth. The Bellwether residence materialized before him, a somber edifice etched against the lunar canvas. Approaching with caution, every nerve hummed, attuned to the slightest disturbance. The unwavering cadence of crickets was the only sound, a steady, insistent pulse cutting through the stillness. He inched towards Martha's porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. He settled the basket onto the weathered planks, taking pains to avoid any noise. A sudden impulse surged to knock, to offer a word of comfort, but he resisted. Anonymity was both her armor and his. He retreated into the darkness, leaving the basket as a silent testament to his empathy. The following morning, Martha emerged, her shoulders stooped, her face an essay in exhaustion. She halted abruptly, her eyes widening at the sight of the basket on her doorstep. She approached it warily, as if anticipating a cruel hoax. Kneeling, her fingers traced the basket's rough texture, her brow a knot of confusion. She lifted the covering, her breath hitching in her throat. Her gaze darted around, seeking a benefactor, but the world remained stubbornly empty. Only silent houses, watchful trees, an indifferent sky. She reached into the basket, her fingers trembling as they brushed the smooth glass of the peach jar, the yielding crust of the bread. A solitary tear carved a path down her worn cheek. Who would commit such an act? Who would bestow such kindness, such unexpected grace? She gathered the basket, her movements deliberate, as if fearing its disappearance with any sudden gesture. Inside, the aroma of coffee unfurled, a rich and comforting fragrance absent for too long. Setting the basket on her time-worn kitchen table, her gaze lingered on each object. She picked up the peaches, turning the jar in her hands, admiring the golden fruit suspended in its sugary embrace. It was a luxury forfeited long ago. A surge of gratitude, almost overwhelming, threatened to buckle her knees. The giver remained unknown, yet one truth resonated. Someone cared. Someone had seen her, acknowledged her pain, and offered a fragile lifeline in the encroaching darkness. And in that instant, a spark of hope ignited within her heart, a delicate flame defying the oppressive shadows. It was a small offering, a mere basket of provisions, but it was sufficient. Enough to sustain her, enough to remind her that she was not utterly alone in the world. Suspicion and increased cruelty. The clatter of plates shattered the fragile piece Martha had pieced together after finding the basket. She'd managed to sneak a slice of the ham, the salty tang a forgotten pleasure on her tongue, before shoving the rest into the root cellar, hoping to dole it out in secret rations. But the suspicious silence that had followed breakfast was far more unsettling than any shouting. Eliza Bellwether, her mother-in-law, a woman whose face seemed permanently etched with disapproval, cleared her throat, the sound sharp and deliberate. Someone left a basket at the door last night. Martha's stomach lurched. She kept her eyes down, focusing on scrubbing a non-existent stain on the worn wooden table. I didn't see anything. Don't play coy with me, girl, Jedediah Bellwether, Eliza's husband, snapped. His voice, gravelly and laced with suspicion, made Martha flinch. A basket overflowing with food. More food than we've seen in this house in months. Who would leave such a thing? Martha wrung her hands, the knuckles white against the rough skin. I don't know. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Eliza's eyes, cold and piercing, narrowed. Did you tell someone about our situation? Did you go crying to the neighbors, begging for handouts? No, I wouldn't. The denial burst from her, desperate and raw. I haven't spoken to anyone. Then explain it, Jedediah demanded, slamming his fist on the table. The dishes rattled, and a chipped mug tumbled to the floor, shattering into pieces. Explain why someone would be giving you charity. Martha's mind raced. She couldn't tell them the truth, that she hadn't the faintest idea who'd left the basket. That would only fuel their anger, their conviction that she was somehow responsible for this perceived slight. Maybe it was a mistake, she stammered. Maybe they meant to leave it for someone else. Eliza snorted. A mistake? A basket filled with ham and fresh bread? Don't insult my intelligence, Martha. Someone knows you're here. Someone is watching you. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Martha felt a tremor run through her. She was trapped, a fly caught in a spider's web, and the web was tightening. The punishment was swift and brutal. The next day, Martha's workload doubled. She was assigned the task of clearing out the chicken coop, a job usually reserved for Jedediah, the stench of manure clinging to her clothes and skin long after she'd finished. Eliza kept a close watch, her lips pursed in disapproval, finding fault with every movement, every sweep of the broom. The meals, already meager, became even sparser. Martha found herself gnawing on stale bread crusts, her stomach constantly aching with hunger. Sleep offered little respite, her dreams haunted by the accusing faces of her in-laws, their voices echoing in the darkness. One evening, as she was scrubbing the kitchen floor, her hands raw and bleeding, Jedediah loomed over her. You better hope whoever left that basket doesn't come back, he growled, his breath sour in her face. Because if they do, you'll be the one paying the price. Martha didn't reply. She simply lowered her head and scrubbed harder, the tears silently streaming down her face, mingling with the grime on her cheeks. The hope that had flickered within her, ignited by the unexpected kindness, was now extinguished, replaced by a cold, gnawing despair. She was more alone than ever, her brief moment of solace now a source of increased suffering. The world outside, the world that had offered a glimmer of hope, seemed further away than ever, a distant dream she could never reach. The walls of the Bellwether house closed in on her, a suffocating prison of suspicion and cruelty. Dusty's resolve. The sinking sun draped the Bellwether farm in long, sepia-toned shadows, painting the parched fields with strokes of burnt sienna. From his perch atop a decaying fence post, Dusty Rivers watched Martha. She moved like a ghost among the drooping corn, her posture radiating exhaustion. For days, he'd observed her from afar, a growing disquiet twisting in his gut. Each furtive glimpse chipped away at his optimism. She seemed to be diminishing, the spark in her eyes a mere ember of the flame he recalled from their brief encounter in town. Her steps were listless, her figure thin. The vibrant woman he'd glimpsed was fading like a dying sunset. The scene was a cruel mockery of the memory he cherished. Martha's warm smile, the unexpected kindness she'd offered amidst her own bereavement. He couldn't shake the feeling that his well-intended gesture had backfired, that his anonymous gift had somehow exacerbated her plight. The food basket, intended as solace, had instead become a poisoned apple. He vaulted off the fence, the aged wood rasping against his jeans. He had to understand the truth, the full depth of her anguish. He rode toward town, his usual easygoing manner replaced by a grim resolve. His first stop was the general store, the familiar aroma of spices and tanned leather offering little comfort. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper, was absorbed in arranging fabric bolts, her brow knit with concentration. "Afternoon, Dusty," she greeted him, glancing up. "Find in anything interesting?" "Just browsin', Mrs. Henderson," he replied, attempting a casual tone. He hesitated, then ventured, "Seen Martha Bellwether around much lately?" A shadow fell across Mrs. Henderson's face. "Poor soul. Keeps to herself mostly these days. Jedediah and Eliza are driving her into the ground, from what I hear. Ever since Caleb passed, they treat her more like a hired hand than kin." Dusty leaned against the counter, pretending to examine a selection of tinware. "Always heard they were hard taskmasters." "Hard doesn't even scratch the surface," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Barely feed her, some say. Work her till she drops. And the things Eliza says, downright shameful." She shook her head, her gaze a mixture of pity and condemnation. "Some whisper they're trying to get rid of her, angling for a full inheritance." He thanked Mrs. Henderson and stepped out of the store, the weight on his conscience heavier now. He sought out Old Man Hemlock, the town's resident sage, who spent his days carving wood and dispensing wisdom from his porch. "Hemlock," Dusty greeted him. "Got a question for you." The old man looked up from his whittling, his eyes twinkling from beneath shaggy brows. "Un bulletin yourself, son?" Dusty hesitated, then inquired, "What do you know about the Bellwethers, especially their treatment of Martha?" Hemlock sighed, a sound like brittle leaves skittering across dry ground. "A sorry state of affairs. Jedediah was always grasping, and Eliza's tongue could flay a hide. They resented Martha from the jump, envious of her youth, her good heart. Now that Caleb's gone, they see her as nothing but a leech, draining their coffers." "Are they abusing her?" Dusty pressed, his voice hushed. Hemlock gave a slow nod. "Words are sharper than any blade, Dusty, and those two wield them with a wicked skill. They've isolated her, robbed her of her happiness. It's a form of slow erosion." Dusty stood there for a long moment, the grim reality settling over him like a shroud. He'd feared as much, but hearing it spoken aloud steeled his resolve. He couldn't stand idly by and watch Martha wither, her life stolen by their malice. The basket had been a starting point, but it was clearly insufficient. He needed to intervene more decisively. He touched the brim of his hat. "Thanks, Hemlock." He turned and strode towards his horse, his gait now purposeful. The setting sun cast long shadows ahead, but his course was set. He knew what he had to do. The apprehension that had plagued him was replaced by an unwavering determination. He would help Martha, regardless of the consequences. He would devise a way to liberate her from the Bellwether's clutches. All he needed was a plan. Mounting his horse, Dusty turned back toward the Bellwether farm, a newfound fire in his gaze. The quiet benefactor was gone, replaced by a man ready to act. Subtlety was a thing of the past. It was time for Dusty Rivers to ride to Martha's rescue. A bold proposition. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Dusty Rivers strode towards the Bellwether farm. The air, thick with the scent of manure and simmering resentment, did little to deter him. He found Jedediah and Eliza Bellwether in the barn, their faces etched with the same sour disposition he'd witnessed in town. Jedediah was attempting to repair a broken harness, his thick fingers fumbling with the leather, while Eliza supervised, her arms crossed and her lips pursed. "Jedediah, Eliza," Dusty announced, his voice cutting through the barn's dusty silence. Both turned, their expressions hardening when they recognized him. Rivers, Jedediah grunted, wiping his hands on his overalls. What brings you to our property? I've come to talk about Martha, Dusty said, his gaze unwavering. Eliza scoffed. Martha is our business. Has been since our Thomas passed, God rest his soul, which is more than we can say for some. I've heard whispers around town, Dusty continued, ignoring Eliza's barb. Seen the state Martha's in, working her to the bone, isolating her. It's not right. Jedediah straightened, his eyes narrowing. What Martha does is our concern. She's got a roof over her head, food in her belly. More than she deserves, considering. Deserves? Dusty's voice rose, a dangerous edge creeping in. She deserves respect, kindness, and a chance to grieve her husband in peace, not to be treated like a slave. Eliza stepped forward, her face inches from Dusty's. You stay out of this, cowboy. This is family business. Martha's fortunate we're even keeping her around. Dusty clenched his fists, fighting to control his anger. He'd hoped to reason with them, to appeal to some semblance of decency, but it was clear they possessed none. I'm warning you, he said, his voice low and menacing. Treat her with respect, or you'll have me to answer to. Jedediah threw back his head and laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the barn. You? What are you going to do, Rivers? Write us a strongly worded letter? We're not afraid of you. Eliza joined in the laughter, her eyes glinting with malice. He's sweet on her, Jedediah. Pathetic, really, thinking he could just waltz in here and save the day. Dusty knew he couldn't win. Words were useless against their stubborn cruelty. He turned and walked away, the sound of their mocking laughter ringing in his ears. He found Martha in the small, overgrown garden behind the house. Her shoulders slumped as she pulled weeds. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her hands trembled. She looked up when she heard him approach, a flicker of surprise in her weary gaze. Dusty, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What are you doing here? He knelt beside her, his heart aching at her fragile state. Martha, I can't stand by and watch them treat you like this. Tears welled in her eyes. There's nothing you can do. They control everything. Not everything, Dusty said, his voice firm. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gently squeezing hers. Martha, I know this is sudden, but I want to offer you a way out. She looked at him, confusion clouding her features. A way out? What do you mean? Dusty took a deep breath, his gaze searching hers. Martha, will you marry me? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Martha stared at him, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with disbelief. The only sound was the buzzing of bees in the nearby wildflowers. He continued, I know it's not the way things are usually done, but I can offer you a home, a life free from them, a chance to heal, to find some happiness again. He paused, his voice softening. I can't promise you the world, Martha, but I can promise you respect, kindness, and a safe place to rest your head. He watched her, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what her answer would be. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a glimmer of hope, a spark of something that had been extinguished long ago. Dusty, she whispered again, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Martha, he pleaded, his voice filled with sincerity. Say yes, and let's start a new life together. A new beginning. Martha stared at Dusty, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. His words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Marriage? To him, the idea was both terrifying and hopeful. Jedediah and Eliza's triumphant sneers seemed to fade, replaced by the ghost of a smile she hadn't felt in months. Dusty, I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse and despair. He stepped closer, his gaze gentle yet unwavering. Say yes, Martha. Say you'll let me help you. He reached out, his calloused hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. I ain't offering you a fairy tale. I'm offering you a way out. The weight of her decision pressed down on her. To stay meant certain misery, a slow erosion of her spirit until there was nothing left. To leave meant stepping into the unknown, trusting a man she barely knew with her future. But in Dusty's eyes, she saw not pity, but respect. Not desire, but a quiet strength she desperately needed to borrow. Taking a shaky breath, Martha finally met his gaze. "Yes," she said, the word barely audible. "Yes, Dusty, I'll marry you." The air crackled with the unspoken defiance of her decision. Jedediah's face contorted in rage, his jowls trembling. Eliza let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if Martha had physically struck her. "You ungrateful hussy," Jedediah roared, taking a step towards her. "After all we've done for you." Dusty stepped between them, his stance unwavering. "You've done nothing but bleed her dry. That ends now." He turned to Martha, his voice softening. "Ready to go?" Martha nodded, her hand trembling as she reached for his. His grip was firm, reassuring. With Dusty at her side, she felt a flicker of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She looked back at Jedediah and Eliza, a spark of defiance igniting in her eyes. For the first time since Thomas's death, she didn't cower. They left the Bellwether house without another word, the silence filled with unspoken promises and simmering resentment. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. The wedding was a small, hurried affair. The justice of the peace, a wizened man with kind eyes, performed the ceremony in his dusty office. Martha wore a simple blue dress, borrowed from the seamstress, its color a stark contrast to the perpetual gray she had been living in. Dusty wore his best suit, the one he usually reserved for funerals and special occasions. His hands, though rough, were surprisingly gentle as he placed the plain gold band on her finger. There were no flowers, no guests, no joyous celebrations. Only the quiet exchange of vows, a promise of protection and companionship whispered between two souls seeking solace. When the justice pronounced them husband and wife, Martha felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning, a chance to breathe again. By noon, Dusty's wagon was packed, their meager belongings secured beneath a canvas tarp. Martha climbed onto the seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced back at the town, at the houses that had witnessed her sorrow, at the church where she had buried her husband. A wave of bittersweet memories washed over her, but she didn't linger. It was time to leave the past behind. Dusty climbed up beside her, the reins held firmly in his hands. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Ready for a new beginning, Mrs. Rivers?" Martha returned his smile, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Ready," she said, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. With a gentle flick of the reins, Dusty urged the horses forward. The wagon rumbled along the dusty road, carrying them away from the town that held so many painful memories. As they crested the hill, Martha looked back one last time, then turned her gaze towards the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a promise of a new day dawning. The vast expanse of the open range stretched before them, an endless canvas on which they could paint their future. It wouldn't be easy, she knew, but with Dusty by her side, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness again. As the town receded in the distance, Martha leaned against Dusty's strong arm, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels a soothing lullaby. The air was filled with the scent of sagebrush and pine, a wild, untamed fragrance that spoke of freedom and possibility. They were heading towards his ranch, a place she had never seen, a place where she would start her life anew, a place where, perhaps, she could finally heal. Home is where the heart is. The dust hadn't even settled from their buggy wheels before Jedediah and Eliza came calling. They arrived in a sputtering Ford, its engine coughing like a consumptive lung, and screeched to a halt in Dusty's yard, scattering chickens and sending a flock of sparrows spiraling into the vast Montana sky. "Martha!" Jedediah bellowed, his face flushed the color of a spoiled plum. Eliza, perched beside him, clutched a reticule and glared, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. Dusty stepped out onto the porch, his shadow falling long across the yard. He'd been expecting them, dreading them. He leaned against a porch post, arms crossed, a silent, solid barrier. "She's Mrs. Rivers now," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through Jedediah's bluster. "And she's under my protection." Jedediah sputtered, his face growing even redder. "Protection? She's our kin. We're just here to see if she's all right." She ran off without so much as a "by your leave." "She left a note," Dusty countered, his gaze unwavering. "And as for her being all right, that's my concern now, not yours." He stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You're trespassing. I suggest you turn that heap of metal around and head back where you came from." Eliza finally spoke, her voice sharp and brittle. "You think you could just waltz in here and take what's ours? She's family. She has obligations. Her only obligation is to herself," Dusty said, his voice hardening. "And to me. Now, I won't ask you again." He gestured towards the road with a sweep of his hand. Jedediah, seeing the steel in Dusty's eyes, seemed to deflate. He mumbled something about Martha being ungrateful, then started the engine. The Ford backfired, a final, impotent protest, before lurching down the drive. Dusty watched them go, a knot of tension slowly unwinding in his shoulders. When he turned back to the house, Martha was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He simply nodded and held out his hand. She took it, her fingers trembling slightly. The next few weeks were a revelation. Martha, freed from the oppressive atmosphere of her former home, began to bloom. She started small, helping Dusty with chores around the ranch. At first, she was hesitant, unsure of herself, but Dusty encouraged her, patiently showing her how to tend the chickens, milk the cows, and work in the vegetable garden. He never pushed her, never demanded, never raised his voice. He simply offered her kindness and space to heal. And slowly, she began to heal. He found her humming softly while she weeded the garden, a faint smile playing on her lips. He watched her laugh as a calf licked her hand, the sound like music to his ears. The shadows that had haunted her eyes began to fade, replaced by a spark of life he hadn't seen before. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. The air was still and quiet, broken only by the chirping of crickets. "It's beautiful," Martha said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is," Dusty agreed, but he was looking at her. Her hair, catching the last rays of the sun, glowed like spun gold. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. There was a question in her gaze, a hesitant hope. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gently squeezing hers. "Thank you, Dusty," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." He didn't say anything, just held her hand tighter. Words weren't necessary. Inside the ranch house, the evenings were peaceful. They'd sit by the fire, reading or simply talking. Martha, encouraged by Dusty's gentle questions, began to share stories about her life before Jedediah and Eliza, about her dreams and aspirations. She spoke of her love for books, her talent for embroidery, and her longing for a family of her own. Dusty listened intently, his heart aching for the woman she had been, the woman she was becoming. He shared stories of his own life, of his late wife, Sarah, of the joys and sorrows of ranching, of the emptiness he had felt since her passing. Slowly, cautiously, they began to build a life together. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined, but it was a life filled with kindness, respect, and a growing affection. It was a life, finally, where they felt safe, where they felt at peace. One night, as they sat by the fire, Martha looked at Dusty, her eyes shining with warmth. "This feels like home," she said softly. Dusty smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "It is home, Martha," he said. "It's where the heart is." And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of each other's presence, they both knew it was true. They had found a home, not just in the sturdy walls of the ranch house, but in the unexpected sanctuary of each other's hearts.